Okay, well, let's make a start. Welcome everybody to this CER and IMF co-organised event on a greener labour market, employment policies and economic transformation. This is part of the next World Economic Outlook.
It's already published.
It's already published.
Published in April.
We're delighted to have Niels Jacob Hansen, who's an economist in the World Economic Studies Division of the IMF Research Department, here to present on this issue. We have had some fairly conflicting views on the labour market implications of climate change. The CER's annual economics conference at Ditchley Park in November was on the politics of climate change. And there were some contrasting views. There's big uncertainty about the cost of transition in terms of labour reallocation across firms, sectors and regions, and moving people from fossil fuel intensive production towards kind of labour intensive tasks like building renovation. There are always costs involved in these kinds of transitions. But on the other hand, some of the participants at our conference felt that there were some opportunities to revive employment outside of some major cities in Europe too, because, for example, renewables can be spread across the country compared to, massive, I don't know, like gas, nuclear or coal power stations. So Niels is going to give us chapter and verse and tell us what we should think about that particular conundrum. There's a couple of housekeeping things that we need to say. It's on the record because this is already all published and all good to go. So if there are any journalists in the audience, you're welcome to quote Niels Jacob. People in the room, the mic is incredibly sensitive, so please don't rattle your coffee cups too loudly. And I'll explain the Q&A when we get there. Niels Jacob, you're going to present for about 20 to 25 minutes or so, and then I'll open it up. So please.
Thank you very much. Should we press that?
Yes, I think so.
Is it on that laptop over there?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry.
So thank you very much for having me here to present our findings of this recent World Economic Outlook chapter that looks at the green economic transformation and what this would mean for the labour market. So as you may know, the World Economic Outlook is a publication that comes out 2 times a year, and we have a chapter 1 that looks at the conjuncture, and then we have some analytical chapters that try to take a deeper dive into some issues that are either front and center right now or something that is likely to be important going forward. And this chapter probably falls into that latter category. So in the chapter, we try to look at what this green economic transformation will mean for the kind of jobs that workers do, the sectors where they work, and also how policies can facilitate any needed reallocation of labor. And the chapter and the team that has been working on the chapter includes myself, John Rudorn, Ian O'Reilly, Ipe Shibata, and Marina Treverne. So let me get started with the motivation here. I mean, the motivation for looking at the issue is clear and well known by now. We all know that tackling human-induced climate change is one of the most pressing issues that are facing policymakers, and we also know that it will require transformation of the global economy. But it's like was alluded to in the introduction, it's more uncertain what this transformation will mean for the labor market. It will likely involve moving workers out of carbon-intensive and environmentally destructive processes and into jobs that can help greenhouse gas emissions. And specifically, a key questions that are facing policymakers at this junction is how to facilitate these shifts. So, can I see? Yeah, here we go. So just to ground our thinking a little bit, I want to start by showing you this chart that shows how the average carbon emission intensity, which is measured as the carbon emissions per worker, has evolved over the period 2005-2015. And here we show the development for a sample of advanced economies for which we have comprehensive coverage. And over this 10-year period, emissions per worker declined by around 27% on average, and 1/5 of this has come from shift in employment from higher emission intensity sectors to lower emission intensity sectors. That's the red part of the chart. But the bulk of the decline has been reflecting improvement in emission intensity within sectors over time, and that's the blue part of the chart here. I should also say that when we talk about emission intensity here, we will be referring to the emissions in a given sector, both direct emission from that given sector, but also the induced emission coming from the input from other sectors. So for example, service sector does not emit much, but obviously we are consuming energy from the utility sectors which emit, and we need to account for that. So overall, the picture here suggests that in the past, at least, the sectoral shift in employment has played some role in helping drive down emission per worker. So with that motivation established, I want to examine 3 key questions in this presentation. First, I want to shed some light on how green is the labor market today. And in particular, I'm going to look at the incidence and evolution of green and pollution-intensive jobs, and the characteristics of these jobs and the workers that hold them. And within answering that question, I'll try to be precise about what I mean with green intensive jobs, in the sense that we often talk about green jobs and non-green jobs, but we are often less precise with exactly what we mean here, and I'll try to be more precise now. Second, then I'll also try to shed some light on how easily workers transition into greener jobs. And third, I will try to examine how environmental policies can impact the reallocation of workers into greener jobs. And here we are going to look at the relationship between policies and the share of green jobs in the economy, and also how the effectiveness of such policies can depend upon the structural features of an economy. We are going to look at these questions through a mix of both empirical and also model-based analysis, and I'm going to describe the methodologies as we go along. So, as I alluded to in the previous slide, we need to be, it's important to be precise about what we mean when we talk about greener jobs. And in order to assess the environmental properties of employment, what we do in this chapter is that we are going to look at the issue through a multidimensional approach. So the first lens that we are using is that we are going to look at workers through their occupation. And this occupational-based analysis will consider the green intensity of a worker's occupation, which is computed as the share of green tasks by occupation. And these green tasks are computed in the sense that it's based on existing literature where researchers have been going through each task associated with an occupation at a very high dimensional level, and then computed how many of those tasks can be directly associated with reducing GHG emissions and improving sustainability processes. So there, when you do that, you come up with some more green intensive occupations, for example, what I list here, water resource specialists, also wind energy operation managers. Those are kind of obvious, but it's also important to say that there are also a bunch of occupations in the economy that have some green intensity within them, maybe not very much, but some of the tasks are green intensive, and that gives them a small share. An example would be a financial analyst, which part of the task is to compute the sustainability metrics of a firm, and then that task will be assigned a green score, and then you would get a small green intensity score from that. Then we also computing a pollution intensity of occupation, and here more pollution intensive occupation will include, for example, here petroleum engineers and gas plant operators. And then with that, it's also important to say that when you do that kind of taxonomy and you apply it on the data, then you are of course going to find a lot of works that have a zero pollution and a zero green intensity. And in fact, those kind of jobs in the economy account for the vast bulk of work. So that's the first lens that we look at it through. The other lens that we're looking at it through is the sector in which people are employed. And based on that, you can compute average total carbon emissions intensity per worker. And that will then be the same for each worker in the sector. And as I described before, what we do there is we use the total emissions, which is then both the direct emission of a sector, but also the emissions that are inferred from other sectors. And then for the empirical analysis that I'll show you, we use a sample of 34 countries for which we have good microdata. And this is predominantly the European Union, but also the US, Mexico, and South Africa. So let me move to the first research question, which is how green is the labor market? So in this slide here, I show you how the average green intensity, the average pollution intensity, and the average emission intensity has evolved from 2011 to 2019 for emission intensity from 2005 to 2015. And if we start from the left here, you see that for the average green intensity, the median country in our sample has an average green intensity of around a little bit above 2, and the range of countries ranges from around 2 to around 3%. So not very high scores there, although the scores are kind of going up over time. And when you move to pollution intensity, then the metric is from around 2 to around 6, and that measures also, well, it's not also, but is going down over time a little bit, although at a pretty glacial pace. Moving to emission intensity, then that measure is also going down over time, and you can also see that the distribution across countries in our sample has also become more narrow there. So taken together, all these three panels, they show like a very slow drift towards greener jobs over the last 10 years in our sample. But of course, the urgency of dealing with this climate change suggests that companies are going to need to speed that up going forward. Moving to what you see at the more individual level, this chart here shows how greener jobs are concentrated among a relatively small subset of workers. That's what you see in the left chart. In fact, most jobs have very low green intensity. And this reinforces the point from before that there's scope to green the labor market. And it also illustrates here how maybe we should think about jobs as having shades of green rather than simply being green or non-green. And the chart also shows that these pollution-intensive jobs are also concentrated among a relatively small group of workers. And in fact, like I said before, we find that most of the jobs in the sample are neutral, that is, they are neither green nor pollution intensive. And that also suggests that the reallocation needed at the macro level during the transition may be manageable. And this point is further reinforced if you look at the right chart, which shows how employment is distributed across emission intensities. And this distribution is notably right skewed, reflecting that those workers that have high emissions are relatively few. So let's now look at the distribution of these environmental properties across sectors. And what I show you here is the distribution of these three properties across sectors. And what you see, if you look at the left chart here, is that the green intensity of the green intensity for each sector is relatively spread out. And a similar picture you can see if you look at the pollution intensity. There's also that within each sector there's some spread. And finally, on emission intensity, you also have a spread within each sector, and that spread is coming from country differences, whereas the spread in the first two from the left is coming from individual workers across all the countries. But the takeaway from this chart, we think, is that there is substantial sectoral variation within each sector. So that means that within each sector, there's scope for moving either up the green ladder or down the pollution ladder. And that also starts to hint that's kind of an additional margin that you can think of operating rather than outright reallocation of labor across the sectors for the green transition. So let's now move to the individual workers. So here we can see, how do these three properties that I explained before, how do they vary across various workers' characteristics? Specifically, what we look at here is the skill level and also the geographical location. And what you see here is that higher skilled workers on average have a higher green intensity, a lower pollution intensity, and a lower emission intensity than lower skilled workers. And also what we find is that the green intensity of jobs in urban areas is higher than those of the rural areas, and a converse picture for pollution intensity. I should also say, and John, that coming a little bit back to what you talked about in the beginning, that for the US we have very granular data, and we have a box in the chapter where we try to look at is there overlap between where these green and pollution intensive jobs are located, where you can look at it at the sort of the commuting zone level. And what we find there is that there is actually substantial degree of overlap of the commuting zones that have a lot of green and a lot of pollution intensive jobs. So that's kind of starting to suggest that maybe you can get part of the reallocation without necessarily moving people geographically. Of course, that's for the US only, but at least that's a good piece of news. Another good piece of news, if you wish, is if you look at how these jobs differ in terms of their earnings. And what we try to do here is we compare the average pollution intensive job with the average green intensive job, holding as many other things as we can observe constant. And so it's a Minter type regression, if you wish. And what you see there is when you compare these greener jobs is that they have a earnings premium of around 7% above those of the pollution intensive job, and has been drifting up over the course.
That's controlling for skill level.
That's controlling for skills, that's controlling for skills, gender, whatever other individual characteristics that we have. So of course, so that's 7%. Of course, if you compare that to other types of, there's a literature on explaining earnings premiums, and unfortunately, we can compare earnings of college education in the US. That premium is much higher, but 7% is still like meaningful. And we think that's potentially a good piece of news because it could help attract people into these greener jobs. Then, of course, the question is obviously whether it's all good news, and there the answer that we find at least is no, in the sense that there is, when you look at the probability of transitioning from a pollution intensive job to a green intensive job, those probabilities appear to be quite low. So specifically what we do in this chart on the left is that we look at, for the people that are switching jobs, what are the probability that if you were previously in a job with any green intensity in it, what is the probability that you move to another green intensive job? And there, the probability you see is around 50 to 40%. Whereas if you come from pollution intensive jobs, that's what you see in the second pair of bars on the right. Those probabilities are much lower, lower than 10%. And of course, another way you can become greener if you're coming from pollution intensive job is you can move into a neutral job. But those probabilities are higher, but not much higher. There at around 10%. So this suggests that, at the individual level, although maybe the macroeconomic magnitude we're talking about to the reallocation might not be big, but at the individual level there can be tough challenges. This is kind of unsurprising in a sense that we know from the literature already that occupational changes are always difficult, and in some sense what we are doing here is just relabeling those occupations. This is something so it's kind of consistent what we already know, but it's still something to be aware of, that there can be these challenges at the individual level. So then obviously that's motivating the last part of the chapter, which is how can policies help to get people into greener jobs. And there, the first part of the analysis we do there is we try to look at what's the association between countries that have more stringent environmental policies in place, and the way we measure stringency of environmental policies here is via the indicator from the OECD, which is a composite of various types of policies, including whether how much of a carbon tax you have in place. And what we find there is, if you're starting from the left, is what we find there is that the average employment in countries that have a more stringent environmental policies, they are green. That's greener, and it's less polluting and it's less emitting. And that's what you see on the left. And then if moving to the right one, that right chart is suggesting a channel through which this can happen, in the sense that if you look at countries that have more stringent environmental policies in place, when people change jobs in those countries, they tend to move into jobs that have a higher green intensity and a lower emission intensity. Then obviously a follow-up question to this would be, does this potential effect vary with characteristics of the economy? And there, the answer we find is yes. And specifically, what I want to highlight here is the left chart, where we find that the association between these environmental policies and greenness of employment, that association goes down when you have more retention policies in place, which is perhaps unsurprising in the sense that the purpose of retention policies is to preserve matches rather than promote reallocation. So we think this is a potentially important point at this junction, in the sense that we know that many countries put in place these retention policies during the COVID shock, which made a lot of sense given the nature of the shock, and you wanted to preserve the matches. But obviously, as we hopefully shift gears and start focusing on longer term issues, it's something to be aware of, that they can interact with any climate policies that you want to put in place, and they can avoid getting this reallocation into the greener jobs. We also find that countries that have more coordinated labor markets, they tend to have a higher effect on pollution intensity when they put these environmental policies in place, whereas more generous unemployment benefits, they work the other way. So of course, this is correlations, and it's based on this index that is very high, that it's not very granular in the sense that it combines a lot of different aspects of policy. So what we also try to do is that we develop a task-based model, and in this model we can analyze more granularly how various policies can be used. And the model framework that we're using is a task-based model, and here you can produce two goods. One of them has higher emissions and the other one is associated with lower emissions. And then the higher emission, and each of these goods are produced using capital, low-skilled labor, and high-skilled labor. And what goes into the higher emission goods has relatively more low-skilled labor than high-skilled labor, although the exact calibration of the model is of course coming from data. And then we, in that framework, has a carbon tax, which the way that works is that it shifts the relative price of the higher emission goods to the lower emission goods, and that will then impact consumers' demand. And we calibrate this model to two various economies. First, average advanced economy, and also an average emerging market economy. I'm going to focus on the advanced economy, but we can talk about the other one later if you're interested. And yeah, so in this model, we implement a policy package where part of the elements are kind of well known and from previous work done in the WIO, but part of the elements are also new. So the four elements of the package is, first, we have a public infrastructure investment push and R&D subsidies starting in 2023, and that's for capital and R&D that goes into the lower emission sector. So that's to build up, for example, the infrastructure that you need to electrify the economy. And then we have a carbon tax that is gradually phased in starting from 2023 and then increase with a sharper rate in 2029. So those two elements are from previous work as well. And then we have two new elements, which is more focused on the labor market here. The first element is targeted retraining of low-skilled workers, so that it's retraining that gives the low-skilled workers in the lower emission sector productivity boost, so it increases their earning. And then we have a targeted labor income tax reduction that boosts incomes and stimulate labor supply of the low-skilled workers. And the purpose of those two labor market elements is really to both facilitate the reallocation of labor and also make sure that the package that you implement doesn't become regressive, in the sense that the people that would bear the brunt of the package without the elements would be the lower skilled workers. So we have these two elements to ensure that this path to a greener economy also becomes an inclusive one. So here in this chart, we show how the various elements of these packages contribute to changes of employment. First, in the high emission sector on the left, and second, on the low emission sector on the right. And what you can see if you start from the left and you look at the blue bars is that the infrastructure push is actually increasing employment in the high emission sector initially. And the reason is that a lot of that capital that has to go into the low emission sector is coming from the manufacturing sector, for example, which is in the higher emission sector. So some of all that capital that will then have to be put in place to get the energy transition will have to be produced using polluting processes. So that's why that's postponing the reallocation of labor towards the lower emission sector. But then in the other direction, you have the carbon taxes, the yellow part, and also the training element, which is the red part. And those two elements push in the direction of reallocating labor towards the lower skilled emission sector. And if you then move to the right chart, you kind of have the same picture, but in reverse. There, the infrastructure push is pushing down employment, whereas the carbon taxes and the training elements are increasing employment. And over these 10 years that we simulate here, you end up with a reallocation of labor of around 1% of employment for the average advanced economy. And actually, you also end up boosting overall employment. And the reason that you get that boost of the overall employment is because an important part of the reason is that you have this earned income tax credit that is boosting labor supply, in addition to like securing the income of the low skilled workers, which is also what this chart here shows you. It shows you how the wage after tax income of the low skilled workers changes at the end of the horizon that we're looking at here in 2020, in 2032, when you compare it to the baseline. And what you see here is that the lower skilled workers under this simulation end up with higher after tax income. And that's an important part of that reason is because you have this earned income tax credit part. And of course, the training also helps. So with that, let me conclude by answering these three questions that I posed in the beginning. So the first question I posed, how green is the labor market currently? And here what we found was that the more green and pollution-intensive jobs appear to be concentrated among relatively small subset of workers. And we think an important kind of semantic point, if you wish, is that maybe we should think about jobs as being shades of green rather than simply green or non-green. And that's also then kind of leading to the next finding, which is that you have wide dispersion of these green pollution and emission intensity, both across and within sector, which suggests that like within each sector, there's scope for both moving up the greenness ladder and down the pollution ladder. So some of this transition that will happen might not need to involve direct reallocation between sectors. The second finding is perhaps less rosy in the sense that we find that it appears to be quite hard for workers at the individual levels to move into more green intensive jobs if they're coming from pollution intensive jobs. I didn't show this, but we do find that the transition is easier if you have higher skills. And finally, we find some evidence that these environmental policies can be effective in greening employment, especially if these reallocation incentives are not blunted. In particular, I highlighted the retention schemes. And then also finally, we found that in the model, if you implement this policy package aiming at getting to net zero emissions by 2050, then you get a reallocation over the next decade of around 1% of employment for the average advanced economy and around 2.5% for the average emerging markets. And it's I guess it's one important thing to say to put this into context is that that's actually lower numbers than if you look at the average amount of reallocation that we have seen in the previous decade when it comes to moving people from manufacturing and into services for advanced economies. So taken together, we think that this analysis suggests that the labor market implication of the green economic transformation appear manageable at the macro level. However, at the individual level, that appear to be these tough challenges. And we think that accentuate the need to make sure that you implement policies that can ease the transition to make sure that you get an inclusive way to a greener economy. So let me stop here and yeah, I look forward to take your questions.
Well, Niels Jacob, that was a great presentation. Thank you. I learned a huge amount from it. We'll go to the Q&A shortly. So people in the room and online, if you want to come up with some questions, please do. For people online, there are two ways that you can ask a question. One is to raise your hand, and I will have I will see who's coming up, and then my colleagues will unmute you, and so you can speak into the room. The other way is if you would like to type your question out into the chat function, then I can read it out if people aren't fed up with hearing my voice. So get your thinking caps on. My question is really about geographical mobility, which you mentioned a fascinating point about commuter zones and the fact that there are high polluting jobs and also green jobs. There's quite a lot of overlap in terms of commuting zones in the US. I wonder if you could say a bit more about the extent to which that is the case, because if we think about, for example, the labour market geography of the UK, which is an interesting case, it's not just because we're here that I'm bringing it up, it's that its deindustrialisation was quite rapid. I mean, it was comparatively early. And a lot of the productivity differentials that we see in the UK are down to that relatively rapid deindustrialisation, and also labour movements within the UK of relatively skilled workers to particularly London and the South East, but also other population centres. And we know that geographic labour mobility has been on the decline. Part of that, I guess, is that the UK and other advanced economies have been deindustrializing, and so that shock, which is forcing a lot of people to move, has been dissipating. But it seems as though if you're moving from a polluting job to a neutral or a green job, then that may well require some geographical moves as well. So while your analysis is very hopeful about the possibility of making this transition with huge dislocations, that was one question that I thought could do with a bit more explanation.
Right. Okay, so yeah, let me make a couple of points. So maybe just to be a little bit more specific on the findings that we get from the US, then specifically what we find is that of the 173 commuting zones that are relatively rich in pollution-intensive jobs, that means that they are above the 75th percentile. 125 of those are also relatively rich in green-intensive jobs, or are bordering a commuting zone that are rich in the green-intensive jobs. Okay, so that's just and I can give you the specific numbers afterwards, but then it's in the box we have. But then. And I agree, that piece of element in itself is hopeful, but we also know that, geography is not the only thing that is important for whether you can get a labor market transition or not. And in fact, if you look at this evidence that we have at the individual level, it's less hopeful in the sense that it actually, although, this thing for the US might be true, then we don't see those moves to a high degree when you look at the individual level data. And that's of course also because occupational changes are just generally hard. And And then you made a point about the speed, and I think there, one thing I would say there is, of course, in ours, I mean, a general point would be that the challenge will be larger the more longer you wait, right? In the sense that if you start implementing a policy now and you can gradually phase it in, then there's still urgency, but relatively less urgency than if you wait for a longer time. Then then the transitions you will need to get will become more pressing. Plus, like these low probabilities that I showed you, they're probably more an issue if you need to undertake the transition very fast than if you need to than if you have time. You can also rely on, for example, cohort effects and new people coming into the labor force and older people retiring. So that's a point I would make about that. There was one more thing I thought about. Or let me stop here.
Okay.
Now.
Any? Go ahead. Ian Begg from the
Ian Begg from London School of Economics. I want to raise a conceptual question and a methodological one.
Yes.
The conceptual one is, I think, quite tricky. I'm not sure what your labor market theory, for want of a better word, is behind this, and in particular how that relates to transitions, on which there's an abundant literature. Because I wonder whether, if someone is doing a job search,
Yes.
is green an attribute of the job that they regard as important? Or is it a second or third order consideration when you're faced with a number of potential jobs? If so, then that makes the policy challenge that much greater, because somebody may want to move to a better job at a different location. And if they're not looking or considering green as the attribute that matters to them, then you have to wonder whether your incentives approach is going to work here. And my methodological point is what I call dynamics and interactions. And I start here with a very simple anecdote. 3 years ago, I moved from a drafty, cold office to what I'm told is a carbon neutral office. Am I now more green?
Yes.
And in the same vein,
Yes.
if a dirty occupation, such as, let's say, construction is dirty, is powering away, but producing green outputs, in the sense that they're providing the input for somebody else to get more green, is that going to be captured in your way of thinking?
Yes. Let me maybe start in reverse order, in the sense that you're raising a very good point about the challenges in measuring these environmental properties of jobs, and in fact, that's also why we thought it's important to address it, at least the empirical side of it, from this multidimensional approach, where you both have like the share of green tasks, the share of polluting tasks, and then the emission intensity of jobs. So for your example, I think your example would amount to changing the energy mix into a given job. And in some sense, that would amount to reducing the emission intensity of a job, but not necessarily doing anything to the green intensity of jobs, because the green intensity of job would refer to like the share of tasks that can be directly associated with reducing GHG emissions. And I think that's an important point, in the sense that a lot of jobs in the economies have zero green intensities and zero pollution intensities. And what will probably need to happen with those jobs is that the emission intensity of those jobs will have to be reduced. But the way that will happen might be by changing the energy mix that goes into them. So in that sense, nothing will happen in terms of their green intensity or pollution intensities, but the emission intensity will go down because of something that happens outside of them. So that's how we thought about that last question that you raised. On your first question about whether it's active sort of search criteria, if you wish, then let me make one point about it, which is well, a little bit of orthogonal, maybe still related. So we also have a box in the chapter where we try to leverage data from LinkedIn, which is also trying to categorize jobs based on their greenness. And what we used that for was just because this data that we have here only goes up to 2019. So we use the LinkedIn data to get a more timely view on what's happening. And of course, they are doing their own classification of jobs, more based on like how jobs are described for people that are searching for them. So it's related, but not exactly the same. And what we found there was that the jobs that were classified as being greener in that LinkedIn framework had fared better during the pandemic than the non-green jobs. But it's not really answering your question, I think. So, but I would also make the point that at the end of the day, it's probably the content of each job that matters more than exactly how it's described. And in the sense, at least the empirical part of the chapter suggests that you can move that countries that have these more stringent policies in place see jobs on average that are higher in content of those green characteristics than if the policies are not in place. Okay, yeah, let me stop there.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, Jacob, was about imports.
Yes.
And so I assume that your model was a closed economy model.
Yes.
If you were to introduce an open economy model, what would happen with your policies?
Yes.
Yes. Hence the rationale for a CBAM. So.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And obviously, I think you can think about our policy experiments in the model as something that would happen if everyone was doing the same thing. That's of course not what's going to happen. Different countries will do different things at different times. And the reason, and then you could of course say, is then that type of analysis that we're doing, which is based on each country, is then relevant. And I think my answer to that would be that given that decisions ultimately will need to be taken at the national level, it's important for national policymakers to know what kind of effects they can expect in their own labor markets. Then, of course, you can raise the point that there's then a broader point that if you introduce these policies and there's leakages, and the pollution just moves to other countries, then in some sense that's offsetting the effects on climate, which is ultimately what we care about. But given that we are probably going to move in a staggered way, national policymakers still need to have some sense on what they can expect to happen in their labor market if they undertake these policies. So it's an important caveat, but I would then say that given that decisions will be taken at the national level, we need to have some national evidence there.
Yeah, I think that's right. But then I would also ask, okay, so how, if I'm a policy maker making decisions with an open economy, if we have an open economy model going on, then do we see jobs in industry and manufacturing declining much more rapidly? And then my sectoral reallocation issue being loads bigger. And then there's the question about, okay, what do I do as a decision maker with a short-term political time horizon? And yeah, so it would be interesting to know, I think, to what extent you would see much more rapid shifts in.
I mean, I think you're maybe one way to formulate your question is to say, in which direction would you expect the bias of these estimates to go if people are not moving in the same direction at the same pace? And there are, if anything, shutting down, I mean, if you related to the empirical estimates that I showed, if anything, not having countries moving in the same direction would probably make the estimated switches larger, in the sense that, you know, if there is a scope to move jobs to areas where the same policies are not in place, then you should see more reallocation than if everyone is doing the same. So I would say, yeah, that's what would be one. That would be one. But then that would kind of, if anything, I think reinforce the overall narrative of the reallocation. It's not going to create more relocation than what the estimates here suggest.
Yeah, I think that's right. But also, you're going to have to do it more rapidly, and there's always going to be transition costs in that reallocation, right? You know, periods of unemployment or right.
Yeah. No, and I think there, I think that kind of relates to the narrative which we have, is that although manageable at the macro level, you know, there will still be these challenges at the individual level, especially if things have to be done very fast.
Yeah.
I don't want to hog the floor.
No.
Again, two related questions. I know your data set was, I suppose, OECD countries in a very broad description.
A little bit more, yeah, but no, I think that's pretty good.
Which is, in round numbers, 20% of global employment. And that does pose the question.
Yes.
You hinted very obliquely towards the end about some messages for emerging markets. It's not just emerging markets, it's even the non-emerging markets where there are jobs. And there, a feature of countries like India is a huge proportion of informal employment.
Yes.
And I wonder whether you give any thought to that as a policy challenge, because I very much doubt the informal employees in India have the slightest notion of green, thinking about what they do.
Yes.
And that in turn leads to something which I'm duty bound to mention, because I'm an advisor to the International Labour Office, your sister organisation, and that is just transitions. You mentioned it to some extent with the EITCs, but can we think of a just transition beyond OECD countries?
Yes. No, so also two good questions. So let me say a little bit how we've been thinking about the emerging market challenge. So obviously, there one key parameter that would be different is like the share of employment that is initially in the more polluting sectors, and that share is higher, which is also why in the model simulation you do for emerging markets, you end up getting more reallocation as an effect of this package model. So it's 2.5 rather than 1%. And the other thing that is, of course, important when you talk about emerging markets is that the policy levels, like you were suggesting, are not the same. That are available are not the same. The ERTC requires a pretty granular tax system, and obviously the high share of informal employment is a challenge there. So actually, the way that we implemented that in the model was we don't do it via the ERTC, we use cash trenches. But those are, of course, less well targeted.
But even that presupposes a working social protection system.
Yeah, so correct. So I would say, you know, the policy levels are not the same that are available, and that's obviously another challenge. The way we did it here was via the cash transfers. Yeah. But both those things, I think, pull in the direction of saying that the challenge is higher for emerging markets than for AEs. Yes.
And would you go as far as not even yet emerging markets? Or is it just a binary divide between advanced and emerging?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not a binary, it's a continuum probably rather than, but at least two of the factors that are important there would be like you mentioned, the share of employment is making the challenge larger. The share of employment in more polluting sectors is making the challenge larger. And, you know, the policy levels that you have available is also something that makes the challenge different.
Okay. So we have a fairly sort of quiet group online. You're extremely welcome to put your hands up or to put something in the chat. I just wanted to conclude with a question about the spreads that you talked about within sectors in terms of the share of high emissions jobs and also polluting, carbon intensive tasks and polluting sectors, right? Broadly speaking.
Yeah. So the distribution has showed like the greenness intensity, the pollution intensity, and then the emission intensity, and how they differ across sectors.
So was that within countries or was that across countries?
So for the two first, the green intensity and the pollution intensity, those are across countries.
Okay.
Well, I mean, the distribution come from what you see across all the space of microdata, but then of course the source of variation will both be within and between countries.
Okay.
Whereas when you move to the emission intensity, then the only level of variation we have for each sector on the emission intensity is across countries.
Right. Okay. So in terms of the width of the error bars,
yes,
within a country, do they tend to be much lower, and so the ability of an individual sector to have reallocation of labour from one highly polluting company to a less polluting company is lower.
That's correct. I would make 2 points though. One is that I think the full distribution is still relevant in the sense that that even if a given occupation is not, when you look at the variation is coming from which occupation you see within each sector, and if you have and to the extent that a certain occupation doesn't exist in one country and exists in another country, that could be how big of an issue, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how big of an issue it is, in the sense that you would need some occupations to just not at all be in certain sectors in certain countries. I would not expect that to be a big issue, but it's an empirical question. Then, sorry, was that your only? Oh, sorry. Let me make one more point about it, which is that I would say that one thing that could work in the other direction is that, of course, these greenness intensities are computed based on the tasks that were being conducted in 2010 in the US, right? And probably if you went and redid that classification each year and each country, the picture would look different, and you would, if anything, I would expect probably get wider bands rather than more narrow bands, because things have clearly happened over the last decade. And it's kind of, when you move around, we see it, but this measure is based on how the economy looked in 2010.
One last question, perhaps for me as well.
Yes.
This maybe goes beyond your current project, although it could be put to Kristalina as the next one, and that is that there are jobs which are themselves vulnerable to climate change. Yes. Probably quite extensive numbers of jobs in countries that are facing the most extreme events. Yes. And I wonder if that should be factored into thinking about greener jobs. Yes. That it's not just transition from polluting jobs to green jobs, but also there's a further influence here, which is jobs that are being destroyed because of climate change itself. Yes. And that creates a supply of displaced labor that you might want to think about in a future project.
Yeah, and of course obviously it's endogenous to the policies that are being undertaken, and in some point, like the forcing variables in the simulations that we're doing here are the policies rather than the climate change. But like you say, climate change will itself be a forcing variable that could change, make some jobs much harder to come down.
The point made to me by the person who first raised this with me was that temperatures in New Delhi are now so high that people can no longer work.
Terrifying. Well, on that cheery note, Thank you, Ian. And thank you so much, Jacques. It's an excellent presentation and a great chapter. I will be reading. I haven't yet read it. I've read your slides, and I'm definitely going to read the chapter carefully. I hope this was an interesting conversation between us three at least.
Thank you so much.
And thanks very much for coming.